Thank you, Colonel. Great. So just to give you, I already introduced you to our Facebook Live audience. I've got this going on Facebook Live as well. So maybe we might even get some questions from our audience today. That'd be nice.
Okay.
I'll check that a little bit later in the hour. But my guest today is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff of Colin Powell, a advocate for sanity in the world, an advocate for slowing down the rush to possible war with Iran. So, Colonel Wilkerson, thank you very much for joining me today.
Glad to be with you. And by the way, slowing down the rush for war with Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China.
Syria?
Syria.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot to talk about today. I've done a little research on you. I know you're also an advocate for religious freedom inside the U.S. military against the Dominionist Christianity that's out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But just, I think what most people know you for is being a man of responsibility and a man of accountability, and saying that you participated in a hoax to bring the country to war with Iraq, and that you regret it. So let's kind of get the big thing out of the way here. Tell us about working for Colin Powell and how you had a shift of consciousness.
I certainly was not naive to the fact that the United States, in its darker moments, had done a number of things, particularly since World War II, in the name of the Cold War, that were even bordering on being evil, but certainly were not in the spirit of what I think our founders put together for our democratic federal republic. A lot of these things led by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the way, a creation after World War II. We'd never had such a thing before.
Right.
But when I encountered what I encountered with Powell, it was a new manifestation of this creeping executive power, if you will. The idea that the president can do anything, that he's beyond the law, that he's beyond the other two branches of government, which we're seeing right now, manifested again and again and again in what President Trump says and in some cases does. So I came up against this in a way that I think it had not happened up to that point. And by that, I mean, you actually had, for example, we had torture in the past, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, we tortured people. But we had never had an occasion where the highest authority in the land, the President of the United States, the ultimate executive authority, actually signed off on and authorized torture. At the same time, we had an executive, again, under this plenipotentiary power, this power that never ends, that essentially said, we're going to go to war with whomever we want to at whatever time we want to, and we're going to do it regardless of international opinion and so forth. And so I got involved in that in the sense of Colin Powell's objections to that, no international legitimacy in particular. And we tried to change that by going to the United Nations, and we wound up falling hook, line, and sinker for the intelligence view that turned out to be, in most of its manifestations, particularly the pillars of his presentation, dead wrong.
Right. Most people will remember the famous Colin Powell image of him holding up this vial of anthrax, which was just a prop. Which
was not really the most powerful element, according to polls afterwards. The most powerful element and the most fallacious element was his intimation that there was a connection between Al-Qaeda and 9/11.
Oh, great. Well, you know, I'm kind of a citizen journalist expert on 9/11. I've done 2 books about 9/11. So this is very interesting. I know the 9/11 Commission was trying to, at one point it was floated that Mohammed Atta might have had a meeting in Prague with Iraqi officials, but that was also discounted. And it's part of the whole hoax. The war on terror is largely a hoax.
This was powerful in my memory and was really the incident that convinced me I was being lied to, and so was the Secretary of State. It was when he, about the 3rd day out at Langley at CIA headquarters, he did something he'd never done before. He actually physically accosted me, if you will. He grabbed me by the collar and he led me down the hall and he put me in a room in the National Intelligence Center spaces. And he looked at me and he said, you think this is confidential in here? And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, it is the CIA. He didn't even smile or laugh at that. He sat me down and he told me in no uncertain terms, profane terms on one or two occasions, that he thought the business of Saddam Hussein's connections with terrorism, in particular Al-Qaeda, stunk to high heaven. He called it Deuteronomy plus. And by that he meant that we were doing it by saying Muhammad begat Ahab, begat so forth. And there was no connection whatsoever that we could actually verify. And Mohammed Atta's meeting in Prague, supposed meeting, was a part of that because it had been totally debunked by all the intelligence community. It didn't happen.
Right, right.
And yet Vice President Cheney was still using it. So I then said, boss, look, I've got no objections. I think it stinks too. So he smiled. I think he thought I was going to object. And he said, take it all out. So I went to Lynn Davidson, the person preparing the presentation, told her to take it all out. Well, John McLaughlin heard me say that. He was George Tenet's deputy, the Svengali of all this. John lied repeatedly. And so within 30 minutes to an hour, when we reassembled in the DCI conference room in order to resume the rehearsal for Powell, George Tenet comes in with this bombshell message. And he says, he says to the secretary, this is almost a quote, we've just learned from interrogation of a high-level Al-Qaeda operative of contacts between the Mukhabarat, the Iraqi secret police, and Al-Qaeda, to include training Al-Qaeda operatives in how to use chemical and biological weapons. Powell turned to me and said, put it back in.
Well, what was his proof?
His proof, we found out later, 3 months later, was the interrogation in Egypt by torturers, no U.S. personnel even present, of Sheikh al-Libi, one of the Al-Qaeda members. And al-Libi had been waterboarded a number of times. Everything the Egyptians used on him was used. I mean, they tortured the heck out of him. And he admitted later, a few days later, he said, I would have said anything to stop the torture. And the DIA, because of that recanting by al-Libi, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, put a burn notice out on that right away. But George Tenet didn't tell us that. John McLaughlin didn't tell us that. So we went into that presentation with what would prove by polling to be the most effective part of it on America, in particular America. And it was all fallacious. It was all fallacious. And we knew it was fallacious. That is to say, the intelligence community at the top knew it was fallacious, and yet we went ahead with it.
Great.
And that was the most egregious of the lies, but there were others too. And you intimated that I had recanted from that. I certainly have. I think it was the lowest point in my professional and personal life. I wish I'd never been associated with it.
Great. So I've got a lot of questions about the legality of the Iraq War. Tackle those first, and then I'll ask you more questions about 9/11 and the war on terror. So Vincent Bugliosi and Elizabeth de la Vega, former federal prosecutor, have both written these books that make a legal argument that George W. Bush could be tried for murder or for fraud, that there could be a legal ramification of the Iraq War. Are you aware of these legal arguments, and what's your take?
Yes, I am, and I went through them. I went through them with Colin Powell's counsel, Will Taft. I went through them with John Berenger, Condi Rice's counsel at the time, and other people on the outside. And there is a good argument for the entire invasion of Iraq in 2003 being under international law illegal. My point has been, that's not the real kicker. The real kicker is the war crimes ordered by the President of the United States that resulted in torture. That's a war crime, domestically and internationally. A lot of Americans don't understand that when we signed up to the International Convention on Torture and Abuse, we signed up to a treaty that essentially said we had to make our domestic law conform. And we did. We expressed a few reservations, but they weren't the kind of reservations that would make this a different matter. It is clear under domestic law and under international law that George Bush perpetrated war crimes by ordering torture. And whether they covered it up with the chapeau of that, pardon my pun, tortured legal argument, that came from Bobby and you and others in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department is irrelevant. because under domestic and international law, clearly they ordered war crimes. So that's what I would go after him for if I were going after him.
So inform our viewers, the treaty on torture you're talking about is not the Geneva Convention, but is...
No, it's the UN Convention on Torture and Cruel and Unusual Punishment, UNCAT it's called, an acronym.
And so the U.S. Congress agreed to that?
Yes, yes. With
What
several
year?
reservations, Bill Clinton's administration, several reservations were expressed, but those reservations aren't pertinent.
Good. Good to know. I did not know that. So that's somewhere in the 90s.
That's why I've said repeatedly in public that Dick Cheney and George Bush should be tried for war crimes.
Excellent. Okay, great. So this is a very interesting conversation, and I'm definitely going to feature that argument in my newspaper, New York Megaphone. It'll be out in late February. I'm also somebody, 9/11 affected me personally. I was an independent publisher about the truth about young Governor Bush before 9/11. So I was really in the trenches from 99 to 2001 doing this book with a writer named Jim Hatfield. And he talked about the Bush bin Laden business relationship. So this is why it's kind of personal for me, Lawrence. So let's dive right into 9/11. You mentioned Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which makes me remember that I've also interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer of the Able Danger operation.
Yeah, I know Tony.
Oh, great, good. So yeah, there's a lot of commonality there. He also was tasked with finding is Al-Qaeda in the USA in year 2000, but it seemed that certain Pentagon higher-ups in year 2000 put the kibosh on his investigation. It seemed that certain Al-Qaeda assets might have been protected from the DIA by Pentagon top brass. There might have been some sort of Saudi connection that was a protected intelligence asset. Have you looked into the Able Danger hearings that your friend, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, did with Representative Kurt Weldon of Pennsylvania?
I have, and I've looked into far more extensive dealings in that regard. I've had over 400 students on 2 university campuses from time to time helping me with case studies and research, which is why I keep telling people like my old boss, Powell, and former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, I probably know more about the first Bush administration than they ever will, because I've had really brilliant students beavering away in libraries and archives and so forth, doing case studies on this. I know much more now.
The George Herbert Walker Bush administration.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm talking about the George W. Bush administration.
Okay, sorry.
I know a lot more about that administration and the Herbert Walker and Clinton too, because we've done a lot of case studies on it.
Right.
I have to tell you that one of the things we learned was, and I think this is a general statement that's accurate, more incompetence than anything else ruled the roost, if you will, during this time frame. There were some people who lied and cheated and stole, just like there always are, just like there are today. But basically what you had was a CIA operation to turn an Al-Qaeda agent, which is clearly understandable. They didn't have anyone inside Al-Qaeda. They knew the only way they were ever going to get real insight on Al-Qaeda. And remember, the intelligence people, they don't want to take people out. They want to turn people and use them as double agents and so forth. So they're not like the FBI, who wants to capture someone, build a case and try them and put them in jail or worse.
Yeah, you got me on this. I'm interested in this line of reasoning. I think Mohammed Atta had CIA connections through his drinking buddy, Wolfgang Boehringer. Does that name ring a bell?
Yes, yes. And I've found tendrils of connections all through here that probably come back to this effort by the CIA to do its usual in turning someone and using them. And so they don't want the FBI to know anything about that, particularly if they're trying to do that domestically. If the person is in the United States, they're trying to do it because that's against the law. They're not supposed to be doing their sort of things inside the country. That's the FBI's counterintelligence people. So you run into this cultural clash where they're doing these things and not telling each other about it. I think that had as much to do with what led to 9/11 as anything else. I've read most of the theories about Israel really was perpetrator of the tower crash and inside explosions and so forth and so on. And while I'm open to all this, to include in New Hampshire listening to two physicists, one from MIT and one from New Hampshire, I believe, University of New Hampshire, explain to me in intricate detail in a field I have no knowledge in, of how the buildings couldn't have collapsed the way they did had planes struck them, the way the story went.
Right. For the sake of the argument, let's take the Israel part and analyze that later. But right now, let's just focus on the architecture and the engineering. So this is interesting. Were these people that you met with in New Hampshire physicists from the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, or who were they?
They were just people who were weighing in from their particular expertise, in most cases, scholarly expertise, either engineering or building structure, architectural structure, and so forth.
Right.
And though I've been exposed to all of that, I still come back to a conclusion that what was shown was what actually happened. That bin Laden was responsible for it, that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the planner, and so forth. That's what all of my research has demonstrated. So I've tried to keep an open mind about it, but at the same time, the research that we've done seems to indicate that what was portrayed as happening, generally speaking, is what happened.
Right.
The real crimes, if you will, begin to occur after it's happened. From the moment Dick Cheney takes over as president of the United States unconstitutionally, to the moment that we perpetrate the war in Iraq and all that unleashes in terms of the Middle East. And at the same time, let me add that there were people who wanted that unleashing. I'm convinced of that. There were people in the United States and people in Israel who wanted that unleashing. The catastrophe that we have in the Middle East now, they wanted that.
Right.
Because one, they thought that kind of chaos protected Israel. As long as the Arabs, Persians too, were fighting each other, they couldn't fight Israel, couldn't unify and fight Israel. And secondly, it made the picking up of the pieces afterward, pieces that were wrapped in oil, much easier than it would have been otherwise. And so I put two major objectives on it for these people. One was the security of Israel in the way they thought it was secured, and two, getting their hands on that oil. And Israel's part of that too, because discounted oil to Israel has fueled its economic rise in the past 30 years. And that's a story in and of itself. Mark Rich is involved in it. Clinton pardoned Mark Rich. Mark Rich was as unscrupulous a dealer as you'd ever want to see. He made sure that Arab oil got to Israel at a discounted price. Gary Vogler has written about this.
Yes. Hillary Clinton played a role in those Clinton pardons as well. You know, her.
Yes.
I think that there's something to be said there. If progressives and liberals still can't fathom why Trump won, it's really not Trump's virtues as much as it is Hillary's vices. I've always argued.
Yes.
And things like the Mark Rich pardon. I heard rumors through my intelligence circles, just different assets and different people that have come through the door in my life, that there was like $1 million payoff to the Clintons for the Mark.
How about $1 billion?
Yeah, you've heard bigger numbers, right. And it sounds kind of like you agree with General Wesley Clark, who said that inside the Pentagon right after 9/11, he was told that there were 7 countries that were all enemies of Israel or neighbors of Israel, or some of them were African, but they were all Islamic nations or Islamic majority nations, and they were all on a list of countries to be attacked, right? Including
my first briefing in the Pentagon from an Air Force 3-star general in February of 2001. I almost fell off my chair because the briefing included, on the one hand, the Air Force's ability to take out 80 to 90% of the targets in North Korea in the first few hours of an aerial strike on that country, to, hey, when we do Iraq, we're going to do Syria and Lebanon, and we're going to do Iran and maybe Egypt and so forth and so on. And I'm sitting there, you know, I'm a military professional. They're doing contingency planning. You may know in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, we had a war plan for Britain. You know, you plan against all those powers in the world you might have to fight. But this was more than that. I listened to it, and this was more than that. Wes Clark is right. They had these plans. They were going to go right through all the countries that they felt threatened Israel, all through those countries that they felt threatened 25, 30% of the world's oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
Great.
That's what they were doing.
Let me ask you a question that takes the Iraq War hoax and tries to present information that will, I think, further deepen your understanding of 9/11 as a hoax. Because, first of all, what's your opinion of Mr. L. Paul Bremer?
Well, I'd known Jerry for a while before we selected him to be our CPA guy in Iraq. And Jerry was very helpful to me with young kids in the District of Columbia, for example, getting scholarships for them and so forth. But Jerry was not the person that should have gone to Iraq. Jerry didn't speak Arabic. He didn't know anything about the region. If anything, his expertise was in counterterrorism. Is
Jerry a nickname for L. Paul Bremer?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
So you know him personally, and you think he's a man of integrity and character?
I don't know him well, but what exposure I did have to him, as I said, with the young kids we were getting scholarships for in the District of Columbia, it was a positive experience.
Okay.
He was out of his element, I think. He simply didn't know what he was doing.
Right. Did you know, Lawrence, on the day of 9/11, he was stranded in Baltimore and trotted out on television, and the newscasters didn't know who he was, but he introduced himself as L. Paul Bremer, a terrorism expert, and they said, what do you make of 9/11? And he said, it's clearly bin Laden. It's clearly bin Laden who's responsible for this. In the same way, Jerry Hauer, somebody I've interviewed, who is a Giuliani, was part of Giuliani's. He was Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's director of the Office of Emergency Management at one point. He's very close to Stephen Hatfield, the anthrax suspect. They actually did a presentation together at the Council on Foreign Relations before 9/11 about bioterror. This guy, Jerry Hauer, is also very strange because it's similar to L. Paul Bremer. On the day of 9/11, Jerry Hauer was trotted out on television and was talking to Dan Rather. As Dan Rather said, surely an attack of this size must have some sort of state sponsorship. And Jerry Hauer said, no, clearly it's bin Laden that we should be looking at. And then
I have to say that was the consensus of most of us, even at the State Department, almost immediately. Those of us who had been keeping up with Al-Qaeda and keeping up to a certain extent, and we got some of this in the transition briefing in December 2000. Remember, it was a very abbreviated transition because of the Supreme Court decision about who would be president. So we didn't have much time. We only had about 30 days.
The August 6th, you're talking about the August 6th presidential memo?
No, we're talking about the election of George W. Bush. It was contested. Remember the hanging chads in Florida and so forth?
I remember that very well, yes.
Yes. So we had the shortest transition time probably in the history of the American presidency. So we really listened to Dick Clark, the terrorism czar. We really listened to others, Cofer Black and so forth, because we thought another embassy would be hit, we being the State Department. We just lost people in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi from Al-Qaeda attacks on those two embassies. And we had been very much involved in looking at what happened in Yemen to USS Cole when Al-Qaeda struck that warship and killed 17 or 19 American sailors. I forget the exact number, but it was a tragic incident. So we thought we were going to be hit overseas again, tomorrow. We just knew we were going to be hit again. So we wanted to listen to all of this. And so once we heard that planes had hit the towers and saw the black smoke coming out of the Pentagon across the river, we knew it was Al-Qaeda. I mean, there was no question about it. So anyone who'd been associated with counterterrorism efforts in the government through the previous 10 years or so would have probably said just that. It's Al-Qaeda.
But without any kind of investigation, and without any kind of corroboration, it seems that a thesis or an alibi or an official story was being presented as a fait accompli to the American people through mainstream media channels, through so-called experts, especially the ones that are the ones that have the creepiest connections to an oligarchical exploitation of, you know, of war and war profiteering, like L. Paul Bremer and Dick Cheney and Halliburton. So L. Paul Bremer is, you know, the future special envoy to Iraq, where he presided over, you know, a very corrupt system of war profiteering to benefit contractors like Halliburton. So it seems to me that there's if you look at the media trail, it seems to me that this official story was being presented. And also, this is also something very similar, that Dan Rather said that the way the buildings came down, he said, geez, it really looks like the kinds of demolition where they set the TNT and they explode the buildings. And Jerry Hauer also, with a similar kind of confidence, said, no, it's clearly because of the jet fuel fires weakening the steel. Now that, Lawrence, has no architectural precedent. And I'm sure you know, if you're working with your students, 400 students doing case studies, you'll know that it's never happened before that steel buildings have collapsed.
Well, you've never had two huge passenger liners full of fuel running into two buildings like that either. So
World Trade Center 1 and 2 were built to withstand the impact of a jet.
Well, maybe so, but I wouldn't want to be in the building. I don't care how many architects or engineers assured me the building would stand up. There's no way I'd want to be in there.
Did your friends in New Hampshire ever ask you about Building 7?
Yeah, well, they made some comments about it. I still have one of the over 400-page analyses here, and I look at it from time to time. I'm not discounting the possibility, but let me offer this. If we have a government or a plutocracy, and it would more apt to be the plutocracy than it would the government, that did something like this in conjunction with Israel or Saudi Arabia or both, hey, I'm moving to New Zealand tomorrow.
No, you're
I don't want to be here.
I refuse that answer.
I do not want to be here.
Don't chicken out on me after all you've done. You can't chicken out now. No,
you're talking about the ability of our government or wealthy people behind that government to manipulate 330 million people, or indeed 6 billion plus people in the world, in a way that I don't have anything to do with.
Gulf of Tonkin, Battleship Maine.
Yeah, but those are, I've done all those case studies multiple times with brilliant students, and I can tell you all about LBJ's decision with regard to Vietnam.
I'm just saying that we need a casus belli. We need
no question. No question. We are an empire, and we need an other. And if there isn't an other there, we'll manufacture one. I mean, that's clear. And what we do in the world today, I ask my students in seminar, if we overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in 53 and Jacobo Arbenz in 54, messed around in Africa for 10 more years, overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile, did Iran-Contra, and on, 58 covert operations in Ronald Reagan's 8 years under that insane CIA director, Bill Casey. Right. What do you think that your government's doing in your name today that you won't read about for 25 years, if ever? What do you think? I'll tell you what they're doing. They're in Caracas trying to overthrow Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro after him. They're in Kiev trying to back the Nazis to overthrow the existing government in Kiev. They're in Syria trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in conjunction with the Saudis. They're in Tehran trying to undermine that guy. They're everywhere, all over the world. David Petraeus, when he became CIA director, said, this is quoted in Steve Cole's book, Directorate S, said to his Pentagon buddies after he'd just been appointed and briefed in, quote, "You won't believe what we're doing all over the world," unquote. This is David Petraeus. This is your CIA. This is your empire. This is the United States of America.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Israel. If you are having a hard time believing that 9/11 was a hoax, you could also look at the fact that it seems to me that in modern American statecraft, false flag attacks are kind of part and parcel of the way the state has to work, like in the King David bombing or the Lavon affair or the attack on the USS Liberty. It seems that our ally Israel has taught the US deep state a thing or two about the way that a false flag attack can emotionally fire up a population and get them ready for war. What's your comment?
Well, I take it from the PNAC report, the Project for a New American Century report, that some sort of Pearl Harbor event is needed in order to get the American people energized about protecting their empire beyond the Cold War. And you can open parentheses and say, and protect Israel, close parentheses. And I don't put that aside for a moment as a logical thought. I just have some difficulty after some 40 years serving in the government, various places, various presidents, believing that there'd be enough competence within that government to pull something like that off and have it remain a secret. Now, I don't put it beyond the plutocracy. If you told me that Charles and David Koch, or you told me that Sheldon Adelson, or you told me that some of these other people, Paul Singer, some of these other billionaires and so forth, had put together a plot to do something like this, a false flag operation, for example, I'd be far more believable. I mean, I'd find that far more believable. The government's too incompetent. It's just too incompetent.
Well, there's compartmentalization, and an intelligence operation only needs to, need to know basis for every asset.
Somebody's going to blow the whistle, though. Somebody is going to blow the whistle. I'm just reading about a whistleblower this morning about the UAE. Maybe you picked up on it. It's incredible. I knew this stuff was going on. I've been telling Congress about this stuff. Yesterday, I sat with a senator for an hour, and we talked about this, among other things. And here this morning, we got this whistleblower who's working for the UAE, used to work for the NSA, and she's now saying that the UAE, with using NSA former employees and knowing what the NSA can do and does do, they've turned that on American citizens from the UAE, and she's blown the whistle on it. Good for her.
I didn't see the story. What exactly is the gist of the story, and who is the whistleblower?
She left the CIA, or left the NSA after many years, and interestingly, she left because she was one of the instruments of hiring Edward Snowden in Hawaii. And so, working for Booz Allen Hamilton at the time as a contractor, having left the NSA, she got a bad rep because she had been responsible for hiring Edward Snowden. I don't know whether that's legit or not, probably typical bureaucratic reaction. So she leaves, and she's hired by this company, US company, that is working for the Emirates. And so she's in their NSA equivalent, and they're doing all kinds of surveillance of human rights violators, of people against the government in UAE, and so forth and so on. Then all of a sudden, she begins to get into more sophisticated stuff, and she realizes she's monitoring American citizens, monitoring the U.S. from the UAE, and she didn't like that, so she blows the whistle on it.
Great.
And all in this long article this morning.
Great, good for her. Thank you for letting us know and letting our viewers know. I know you've only agreed to be on for an hour, right? So we've only got 15 more minutes or so. But
wow, time passes fast when you're having fun, doesn't it?
Good. I'm glad you're having fun. I'm having fun too. This is great. Let's talk about what people can do today to reestablish democratic sovereignty over the U.S. government. What do you think about the upcoming presidential election? What did you think about the midterms? And I know you're a Republican. You also are part of an organization that believes in religious freedom inside the U.S. military, and we want to cover that in the last 15 minutes. And if anybody on Facebook Live has any questions, please let us know in the comments, and we will ask Colonel Wilkerson your question. So
I think the most important thing that's happened recently is this turnover in the House of Representatives in particular. I've met with a lot of them, and these are young men and women, many of them veterans, who are not there for personal power, not there for political power. They are there first and foremost to deliver what their constituents told them they wanted. And second, they're there to correct this ship of state. And one of their major concerns is this interminable warfare that seems to be a part and parcel of this empire today, that you have to stay at war consistently.
Permanent war. Have you met with Representative Tulsi Gabbard?
I have, yes. And Tulsi is a rare creature with courage unparalleled. And she's being pilloried for having that courage, whether it's her visit to Bashar al-Assad in Damascus or whether it's her opposition to this warfare state. she's being pilloried because she's flying against billions, if not trillions of dollars of profits in the military-industrial complex. And I admire her for that.
I admire her as well. She's also the only Hindu member of Congress. She seems to be benefiting from Eastern traditions, Eastern wisdom, meditation. She's very grounded.
Yes, she is.
Right? Which kind of gets us away from some of the, I think, the dark side of American Christianity, which has endorsed the Islamophobia or the...
And the warfare state. Some of the most strident. Yeah, some of the most strident advocates, either for a messianic reason, they think we ought to bring Christianity at the point of a bayonet, or for a more nefarious reason, which is wrapped up in this money and profit and all the things that go along with that power.
Right, right. I just want to say that I think anybody who studies the historical Jesus finds a very radical, grassroots, decentralized, populist figure who was against the religious establishment of his day, against the
He was a socialist. He was a communist.
That argument has been made, and I think there's some serious truth to that.
And the funny thing about Israel these days is that all the people who were pushed out of Europe who went to Palestine, not all of them, but a great majority of them were communists. And what I saw in Israel in 49 and 50 and 51 and on was kibbutzes. And I saw an ideology that bordered on utopia, wanting to form a really socialist state that was pure and Jewish. What do we have today? We have the most predatory capitalist state in the Eastern Mediterranean with 60 families owning about 56% of the wealth and owning most of the land that the security complex doesn't own, or they own it with the security complex. So it's a hell of a state today.
Yeah.
It's not what its founders wanted it to be.
Let's talk about there's legislation out there, HR 1697, I believe, here in the 12th Congressional District. Representative Maloney actually was a co-sponsor of this legislation that would make BDS illegal. So there's a movement trying to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel for its lack of...
This is George Orwell's 1984 come true.
Yeah, yeah. And so now there's legislation for contractors, even in Texas, if you take federal money for disaster relief, you have to sign this caveat that says you will not support BDS. They slipped it into this legislation, and it's been exposed here and there. But what's your take on this?
Well, it's as un-American as it can be, but it shows you the influence. We had a case here in Virginia, and I know it's going on in other states too, where the Israelis had actually so sophisticated. They had come in and they had begun, they had teams. They'd begun to rewrite Virginia's elementary and secondary level school textbooks to rub out any mention of the Palestinians, any mention of the travesty the Israelis perpetrated on the Palestinians, and to make Israel look as if its myth were absolutely pure, simple, clear, and all positive. They're rewriting textbooks in the United States in order to do that. This is insidious, it's pernicious, but it shows you how sophisticated the Israeli operation is.
Right, right. People like Larry Silverstein actually, took over the lease at the World Trade Center just right in July before 9/11, took out a lot of insurance money, got Elliot Spitzer to write an amicus brief to get him more insurance money. There was a huge payout of $4.5 billion. He actually admitted to Frontline that they did pull Building 7. He later denied that he meant controlled demolition, but it looked like on Frontline that he was actually admitting that they did pull Building 7. So that's another interesting connection. Other people have said that Silverstein is close to Netanyahu. They're on 9/11, the Israelis, ICTS was highly involved in controlling airport security on that day. So, Netanyahu said 9/11 benefited Israel. He actually said that it was very good for Israel.
With his strategy, it did. His strategy is this chaos strategy I mentioned earlier, to keep the whole region in chaos so that no one can unite and attack Israel. That's Netanyahu's strategy. And now he's using Iran. He's after Iran for that very purpose. There's no existential threat to Israel from Iran, no existential threat whatsoever. Israel could eliminate Iran overnight with one of its 100+ nuclear weapons. Right. So this is all a fabrication. This is all a politics of fear effort by Netanyahu to maintain this chaos and now bring the Persians into it full score.
But let's think outside the box for a second. How can we get to peace in the Middle East? Do you think Iran should recognize Israel if there were caveats, or if there could be some sort of new path to peace in the Middle East?
I do, but I think the first prerequisite, and I mentioned this yesterday in the Senate, is to stop this canard about the United States pulling out of the Middle East, 2,000 troops out of Syria. We have the largest Air Force base in the world in Qatar. We have the second largest in Saudi Arabia and 11 other bases, the largest reception facility for military forces in Kuwait, the largest fleet headquarters in the United States Navy in Bahrain. We do exercises with each. I mean, it's absurd. The very first thing we need to do is bring that military home. There are no military solutions to the problems in the Middle East. There are only diplomatic, political, economic, and financial solutions. There are 4.5 million professional military in the 22 Arab nations, and they can't handle ISIS? Give me a break. If we compel them to do so by not being there to do it ourselves, they would have to do it, and they would do it. They're not the most competent militaries in the world, but neither is ISIS. So this is crazy. We need to get our military out of that region. It's contaminating the whole region.
According to your sources, who was backing ISIS in Syria?
I'll tell you who started the whole thing, Saudi Arabia. And we pitched right in with Operation Timber Sycamore, which President Trump had the good sense to cancel almost immediately after being inaugurated. We were trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad along with the Saudis. Not that there weren't genuine protests in Syria too, but they were largely nonviolent until the Saudis began to arm and send fighters in. And that's what really got the Syrian revolution, as it were, going. It was a civil war, actually, and it's still a civil war to a certain extent. Now you see the Arabs are all counting their losses, and they're coming together, the Arab League and all the rest, trying to get stability back in Syria, and that means Assad back in control over most of his territory, eventually all of it, they hope. So they've recognized their mistake. We haven't recognized ours. It's a mess. If you want someone to blame for 9/11, in my book, Saudi Arabia.
Well, that actually, you're reminding me of the question I forgot to ask you, which is there is, for people like me who have been voices in the wilderness trying to get a new investigation of the 9/11 attacks based on all of the evidence, not theories, but evidence that something is really rotten in Denmark here. And you could, we're all blind men pawing the same elephant and trying to figure out what exactly happened.
And seeing about that much of the elephant.
Right, that's the whole problem, exactly. But I'll say this, there have been some great victories for the people, who are not the big media and not big government and not big corporations, but people that a majority of people in America, I think, want a new investigation.
One of the ones that really came home for me was the largely women who band together and finally got the Congress to approve their lawsuit against Saudi Arabia. And if you don't know this, you should, and your listeners should, your readers should.
Right. No,
when that case went into court in New York for the first part of the case, they call it discovery, I think, or something like that.
Yes.
The U.S. Department of Justice in that courtroom was not sitting with the women bringing the case. It was sitting with the Saudis, the defendants.
Right.
That'll tell you something.
Right, right.
And that was Obama's Department of Justice.
Right, right. Obama also, who vetoed the JASTA bill. The JASTA bill came out to give the 9/11 victims' families the right to sue any state involved in 9/11, including Saudi Arabia and others. Could be the U.S. state, could be the Israeli state in the future legal actions. And this was inspired by the 28 pages finally being released by Congress, which was what Bush had censored, that proved culpability, or I think proved culpability between certain rich and powerful Saudis and the 19 hijackers on 9/11.
I think the only question remaining is whether or not, what you just said, I think is just certain. The question remaining is whether or not the king and the government itself, as it were, knew about it.
Yeah. Well, according to Joe Trento, author of Secret History of the CIA and a wealth of other great books about intelligence, he's also a DC area native there, or lives there. And he says that two of the 9/11 terrorists, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Al-Hosni, were actual agents of the Saudi GID. So, and I've done a lot of research on these guys, their proximity to Barksdale Air Force Base. They had access to Barksdale. There's a whistleblower named Dr. David Graham who died. State Senator John Milkovich is somebody you should really talk to, and I'm going to help set that up. But the proximity to Saudi Arabia of the 19 hijackers, 15 of the 19 were Saudis. It shows to me that there was, of course, support from the Saudi government, and I don't think it could have happened without a concomitant relationship and support from the U.S. government or the U.S. plutocracy or the U.S. deep state, no matter what you want to call it. But it just can't. The whole operation could not have come forward and have remained uninvestigated for so long. That's the main argument that I think we have: the lack of investigation, the compromised nature of the report.
I don't disagree with you, and I would really like to see the connections between Richard Bruce Cheney and the Saudi royals really investigated.
Right, follow the money, Halliburton.
Yep.
Saudi oil.
And he just kept going. He was always the emissary. And I remember too, I've got pictures, I show them to my students, of Donald Rumsfeld in Baghdad in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war. And there's every reason to believe, from even the limited archives we have, that he was there essentially to help, among other things, sell chemical precursors to Saddam Hussein that became chemical weapons that they used against the human wave tax in Iran. So Donald Rumsfeld has a long reputation of doing, shall we say, nasty things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, going to Tehran and going to the Museum of Holy Defense, that's what they call the Iran-Iraq war. And I was thinking like, oh yeah, both sides were nasty and both sides were equally bad in that war, but it's not exactly true. It seems
no, it's not.
The U.S. kind of backed Iraq. Al-Haig actually admitted that.
Both sides. We were playing both sides.
Right.
Remember, the Iran-Contra affair was selling HOAX and TOWs to the Iranian side, through the Israelis. So we were backing both sides.
Right. Well, for the most part, when we kind of inspired, I think, Saddam Hussein to initiate the Iran-Iraq war and to invade Iran, and we did play both sides.
The CIA thought he was their agent.
Right. Exactly. So
this is the report actually said, I think I can quote it, "This is a young man whom we can work with."
Right.
That was a CIA analysis.
Right. So before we go, tell us more about your involvement with this organization for religious freedom inside the U.S. military. Tell us more about it and why you're involved.
Well, Mikey Weinstein, who's the foundation's executive, called me one day. It was right after Glenn Doherty, the former Navy SEAL who was killed in Benghazi, had been killed. And he said, Glenn was a member of our advisory board and we need to replace him. Would you consider it?
Wow.
And I looked into it and I said, I'm not sure that I want to be involved with this because it looks like it's very oriented towards damaging Christianity. And I'm not a Bible thumping Christian, but I didn't think that was probably a positive thing to do with regard to the armed forces. There are atheists in foxholes. There's no question about that. There are atheists in foxholes, but by and large, most soldiers, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardmen, and so forth, get a lot of solace from religion. So I was not all that. Then Mikey started showing me what he was all about, particularly with respect to the Dominionists and what the Dominionists wanted to do, even to the extent of taking over missile silos and being able to launch nuclear weapons and so forth in the name of God and Jesus. And so I realized, and I'd been 31 years in the military, and this had never been, it had always been there, but it had never been a huge problem. Mikey convinced me that things had changed, and then so I began to talk to other military officers, and indeed I discovered that in some cases, like the Air Force Academy out in Colorado, it changed dramatically. And so I became an advisory member, and since I have learned from his clients, now over 50,000 or so, that there really is a problem, particularly with the sect known as Dominionists, who want the armed forces of the United States to be not the armed forces of America, but the armed forces of Jesus Christ.
Got it. Excellent. Well, it's 10:01 a.m., Colonel, and I want to be true to my word. And is there anything else you wanted to tell our viewers before we let you go?
Just that what I said yesterday in the Senate of the United States, the first prerequisite for anyone running for president in 2020 is to say to the American people, I am going to stop these wars all over the world that are useless, trillion-dollar costs, are draining the treasury, and are unethical, immoral, and stupid.
Wow, I'm feeling that you are blessed, actually, that there's a spirit of truth out there that is speaking through you, and it's not just your words from your personality or your ego or your history, but it's really a universal spirit of love and truth that guides you. And so I say blessings to you, Colonel. Thank you so much for being part of this. I feel inspired. I feel very inspired by you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, great. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hey, thanks a lot for tuning into that. That was really inspiring. And boy, I'm really fired up to do the work that I'm doing. New York Megaphone is coming out pretty soon, at the end of February. And we're going to be getting pieces of that interview into it. So cool. Take care. Bye.